just a couple of days ago, Carl posted a picture of a bowl made out of metal, stainless steel, and bronze that he designed using Inventor software and printed on a 3D printer. So before we jump to sustainability, just talk a little bit about how do you make something out of metal using a 3D printer?
Well, it's a little science fiction-y.
It really is.
It's like Star Trek. So, I mean, the basic process, people know all about printing in 3D. There's lots of examples out there on the table, and most of the 3D printers are a little bit like inkjet printers, and they lay down usually molten plastic. And that's the most common thing. There's a variety of different materials being used. Nowadays, we're able to print in plastic, we're able to print in soft materials like rubber, and this is one in which it's a different technique, but it's used to print out of metal. And it's totally cool. What they do is they use stainless steel powder, and they lay down layers of stainless steel powder, and they use a laser to burn it and fuse it together. And when you're done, is what you get is this structure. It's almost like a sandcastle. It's fairly brittle, but it's welded together, and it's very porous. And then they infuse it with molten bronze. And the thing comes out looking incredible. And the idea that you can, kind of send a file to the printer and get something made out of metal is totally incredible. And, the interesting thing that I thought was most interesting about this, I did it like many people do, this 3D printing, to use as a prototype, with the idea that I would figure out some way to manufacture it. It turns out the design is not that manufacturable. So while I'm fond of the design, it was actually hard to make, and it's turning out to be that the only certainly affordable way to make it is to 3D print it. And at first there was like 6 months I was totally frustrated that I couldn't find a better way to manufacture, and then I just kind of started to appreciate that this is something that you can only really do that way.
Wow. Actually, I would also recommend Carl is a passionate designer and woodworker, and outside you can find a couple of his designs. There's a bench made out of stone, I guess, that you also designed using the software.
Yeah.
And you do this to better understand the product? Is it do you do this during the workday, or is this on the weekends?
Oh, now you're just trying to get me in trouble. No, I tend to do it in nights and evenings, and, I like to think it helps me. I mean, there is a part of it where I'm certainly empathetic, and I don't profess to be a professional designer. I mean, that's what our customers really do. But I'm definitely empathetic by trying and, using software and going through, and because I do these relatively small, our customers, you look out there and you see things, 2,000-foot towers.
Right.
I'm building things on the scale of inches and feet. But the process in some ways is the same, and the workflows involved are similar, and some of the considerations about, how does it look? How does it perform? How good are the tools for expressing the ideas you have? And so I like to think that it helps me in my day job, but I would probably do it anyhow, even if it didn't.
So turning to sustainability, as we heard from Linnell, and I was on your website over the last few days, you are involved in such a broad range of activities. I mean, partnerships with the Green Building Council, this eco-materials company, Biomimicry Institute, which uses the principles of nature to figure out how to better design products. So just a very straightforward business question. Why is sustainability important to the business of Autodesk? What do you tell your board and your investors about the effort you're putting into this? If they were to say to you, for example, you're giving away $150,000 worth of software to these startup companies, what's the business case for all this?
Okay, so the truly candid answer is I don't talk to them about it. Many of them, don't know what we do every day, and I don't talk about it. I mean, because there is this tension in running a company between short-term and long-term. And I think it's also a question of doing what you think is actually the right thing to do. But there is a business case to be made for, having said that, there really is a business case around it. And what I can certainly see in our customers, and a large segment deal with things around the built environment. So buildings, infrastructure, as Linnell talked about, cities. The people involved in that activity are incredibly concerned with sustainable design. And it's probably happened over the last 10 years. I mean, you've tracked it as well as I have. Gone from a dozen years ago where you would mention it and nobody was particularly interested in it. Nowadays, it's harder to find projects in which everybody from certainly the architect to the engineer to the contractor to the owner don't have some stake in making sure that they're building a more sustainable product. So it's become an issue. It's also been a great showcase for what digital design tools do. And, in many ways, whenever you're designing or engineering something, you're working through a series of design constraints. There are millions of things you may be trading off at any point in time, and you're trying to balance one against the other. How much it costs against how energy efficient it is. Sometimes it's how well it does in hot weather as opposed to in cool weather. And what digital design tools do, optimally, is they help you solve that problem. It gives you insight into the problem you're trying to solve before you commit to it in a multi-million, multi-hundred million dollar kind of way. And you get to understand the possibilities much better. Sustainability, like all these other things that people are also engineering, is another one of those constraints where they have to optimize for that as well.
So you're saying, in a sense, that you're investing in all these things, because many of these things are not revenue-generating efforts, to be ahead of your customers.
I think what we try to do, I don't know if ahead is the right thing. I think what our job is in terms of providing software, tools, and services is to understand what our customers really want to do in their line of work, because they don't write software for a living, generally speaking.
Right.
Just like we don't build things, generally speaking. So, and look at what technology is capable of doing and trying to intersect at the right time. You don't want to be too far ahead of your customers because that falls on deaf ears, and you certainly can't afford to be too far behind. So you're trying to find that intersection, and we tend to look to the leading practitioners. One of the interesting things about our business, and that's why things like the Clean Tech Partner Program are great. Some of the work of some of our customers who you can see their work in the gallery, we look for the people doing the most interesting work, who are at the cutting edge, because generally speaking, those who do that well are setting the stage for the rest of the industry that's going to follow behind.
Okay, because this is exactly what I want to talk about here, which is this question of push and pull and where you stand in relation to where, what the world needs and where the world is. So try and break it down a little bit for me. So you have your building, architecture, design bucket of software.
Right.
Then you have a whole nother set that deals, as I understand it, with cities and infrastructures. I saw the Bay Bridge design outside here. And then there's a third one, factories and some consumer products. So if you look at each of those three, walk us through them. Where do you see the sustainability mindset really taking hold? And where do you think a lot more push is needed?
So I think where you see the greatest take-up right now of interest in sustainable design is really around buildings.
So that's leading the way.
That's been, yeah. And I think you have certainly half a dozen years. Things like LEED Gold roll off people's tongues now. You hear building owners talking about it. They're looking for architectural and engineering practitioners, contractors who are familiar with it. That's certainly there. I think cities are getting more interested in the subject, and there's certainly leading cities around the world that have already demonstrated their interest, their commitment, sometimes through legislative means and others. But that's certainly where we see a fair amount, is all around the built environment is probably the single biggest take-up. When you move into the realm of manufacturing, I think it's more divided. You certainly have leading consumer products companies who've taken a keen interest in sustainability. So you have companies, Nike's a good example. But there are dozens of good examples of companies out there who really understand the impact. And many times it comes from the fact that they're selling millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of things, and small design decisions have a huge impact downstream on things like waste or energy efficiency, transportation of the product that they're making. The more traditional parts of manufacturing, I think it's mixed. And when you get into other industries like process manufacturing, even though, a substantial amount of energy goes to pumping things around, moving things from place to place, I don't think it's really made it into at least the most important, the most significant bits of how people are making decisions about what they do.
I mean, one of the paradoxes for me as I cover this arena is I go from one company to another. Autodesk, I think of Google, I think of Walmart, I think of IBM, GE. All the really smart companies are talking about this and doing it. I'm not suggesting there's any greenwashing going on here. So that's one part of the story. On the other part of the story, in absolute terms, we actually generated more packaging last year than we did the year before, I think partly because of online shopping, so people are sending things in boxes. Carbon emissions are going up. They're not, they really aren't slowing down. How do you sort of square all this good work you're doing with the fact that in the sort of broader society, we aren't seeing the results in a macro way?
I think it's incredibly.
And maybe I'm just hanging out with the better companies.
I think there are better companies and better people. You can find gatherings of people who are concerned. I think there's a growing awareness, clearly, about this being probably the most important problem that we have to solve as a civilization. So I think people are becoming aware of it, translating that into action, and you're dealing with economic and demographic trends that aren't really helping. I mean,
you mean more people?
More people with disposable income of what we might call a middle class sensibility, who now have access to buy this stuff. And I mean, on one hand, I was thrilled to see like the Tata Nano car. In some ways you say that's great. You're having an emerging middle class in places like India, and for a million other socioeconomic reasons, that's fantastic. But it's a tragedy that it turned out that that's not an electric vehicle, that it's 5 or 10 years before it would have been practical to make a really low-cost electric vehicle, and we've now put relatively inefficient internal combustion engines in the millions on the road. So we can all get excited that my neighborhood in Berkeley is filled with Priuses. You're not getting 12% better fuel mileage the math just doesn't work to overcome millions of people of putting, small dirty cars on the road.
Well, so getting back to Autodesk's role, you obviously can't be too far ahead of your customers because I assume you have lots of competitors, or at least some competitors. They won't, buy a pure green or dark green product from you if it doesn't solve their problems. But how much, and maybe this is digging too deep into the innards of the software, but when you design this software, do you try to push people towards the more sustainable choices? For example, when the eco-materials information Linnell talked about, I mean, there's this whole idea of choice architecture, not buildings, but the way we architect choices or nudge, that whole idea. Are you doing that?
I think the best thing we can do is give people tools that let them make better decisions. So I think it's hard. I mean, we put out software that's full of stuff, but just as you can make good designs and bad designs with our software, you can make good and bad choices.
So you can. You're not going to eliminate, you're not going to take out the toxic materials.
We're not in the business of going X on your design. You want to print that? No, you can't print it. Just imagine, if you push it to the limit. Your building's too ugly, your product doesn't work well. That's just what people want, is software that grades them. I'm already annoyed when my phone won't even let me type the word I really want to type. I know how to friggin' spell, leave me alone. So imagine the sensibility of a designer who's told by their software that their choices are lousy. I don't think
you can't go there.
That's not the way to win friends and influence people.
Okay.
But I do think you can give people the tools to make better decisions. And what really has to happen is you need broad economic trends that drive things in the right place. So for example, as we've seen with buildings or products, the best thing that can happen is people have an awareness in which they change their understanding. So in the case of buildings, people start worrying about the total cost of ownership of a building as opposed to the cost until move-in, until day one when the keys get turned over. And historically, that was a really common way to think about how much should I spend for this, not recognizing I'm going to run this building for 10, 20, or 50 years, and the ongoing energy costs actually matter. And I think there are possibilities as we go down the road, whether or not, or what form it takes in terms of what does carbon actually cost. As that becomes realized, people are going to need better tools to do this. So what I look at is we have a leading edge of our customers who are already more than motivated and more than sufficiently educated, and they just want better tools to do it. There's this sweet spot in the middle of people who are interested, but don't quite know what to do or don't have the tools to make better decisions. The people who are recalcitrant and just sitting there saying, I don't think global warming is real. If you looked in the Times this weekend, there was a whole lineup of Republican candidates for president, all who have gotten more extreme than the next in denying climate change. Yeah. When you actually read these quotes, some of them, don't actually believe them, right, but are being forced into saying some of the most ridiculous stuff about climate change. You go, I'm sure we have customers like that, and I don't think any piece of software is actually going to change their mind.
Yeah. So let's say, I'm on the cusp as a company or as a designer, as an architect. How do you, forgetting the do the right thing message, not that that isn't important, it is very important, but do you have advice for people like that inside their companies or even people in this room in terms of how to promote what really is long-term rather than short-term thinking? Isn't that what ultimately it comes down to, or at least thinking about the consequences of your behavior?
I'm not sure that's exactly the trade-off, because we've seen plenty of examples, both in the consumer product space, where people given a constraint of saying, let's reduce the amount of packaging. Given that, what it really requires is paying attention to the problem.
Right.
And so I don't think it's particularly a trade-off. As a matter of fact, it may turn out that by thinking about it long-term, you get short-term benefits. Mm-hmm. The question is, were you going through it somewhat mindlessly before and just saying, this is the way we always package this, right, or this is the way we always judge the suitability of a building? All of a sudden you're going to say, there's a different set of criteria that are an important part of it. So I am as concerned with the functional performance of the building as the aesthetic one. And so I think you're just really changing the criteria by which these things are judged. There are examples, I think you're right, where it is a trade-off. But I think in most of the cases...
Solar panels on the roof,
right,
you're going to pay more at the moment in some places than,
in some places,
than great.
But
in other
it's
places
interesting,
not.
In all the places where they say it's going to be more expensive, there seem to be people who take a longer-term view and are building really healthy businesses by taking advantage of our dissonance between short and long-term return. Right. Their entire business are saying, I'll get the financing for it, I'll put it up there, and I'll lease your roof.
Right.
And the only reason they're doing it is because it's money-making.
Yes.
And so there is this question of, do I have the capital available short-term? But it's obviously returns over a relatively short period of time.
Right.
I think most of it, I think most of the evidence is pretty compelling for this. And I don't think you have to do this just out of the goodness of your heart.
Right.
I don't think that's really the argument.
I'm going to just take it out to the audience after one more question, which is, again, having some perspective on this. When you came to Autodesk, so 93?
Back in the dark ages.
20 years ago, almost.
Yeah.
What transparency was there at that time in the product in terms of, material usage, carbon footprint, long-term energy? In other words, has the business just radically changed in that period of time?
Yeah, it's completely.
The availability of computing power and data and all that.
Yeah, so if you go back to the 90s and you look, for the most part what we were doing, we were giving people tools to document a design. It was just a way to get down on paper. It was a computerized way of making a blueprint, which was conceptual schematic representation of what you wanted. There was nothing real about it. The thing that's changed the most over that period of time is the amount of computing power that we now have available. And what we're able to do with that is essentially in every industry in which we participate, people are building 3D models of the thing they're actually going to build. So they're no longer building 2D representation. They're building 3D models that can be used for, simulation and analysis. So I can really understand the thing I'm going to build. And people forget sometimes when you look at these kind of exponential technologies, just what it means. I was doing the math the other day. It turns out that the phone in my pocket has 30,000 times more computing power than that which was launched in the space shuttle. So,
Wow.
right? You take all the resources and you got to send them to the moon. My phone is 30,000 times more powerful than that. The other thing that's interesting is, and I think this is really the important thing, is this idea of where cloud computing comes in, or what we frequently refer to as infinite computing, is this idea that you have access to basically unlimited, unscalable, and almost free resources for computing through the cloud. And when you look at that possibility, I mean, one of the things you realize is that through that same phone, I can access the cloud and I can get access to more computing power than existed on the entire planet just 5 years ago. I mean, and so that's the thing about something that doubles, every year, every 18 months. And so when we look at this, and I think this is where people are underutilizing. So if there's one thing I would say is people are underutilizing computing and treating it as kind of a scarce or somewhat precious resource. And instead, if you say to yourself, in the limit, computing is virtually free. I mean, I can take a computer and I can rent it, an 8-core computer for 5 cents an hour, right? So for an entire day of computing, it costs me 40 cents. To park my car downstairs for an entire day costs $40, right?
It's amazing.
So, right? So it's 2 orders of magnitude more to just park my car than it has 8 cores working on a problem. And so if you kind of extend that and say, there's this incredible power to really understand the projects and the products that we're building, I think people have a greater capacity to use computing than ever before.
Yeah, so the sustainability payoff there, as you talked about the Prius, or I saw there's a Tesla out there. Aside from the electricity, they can make these incredibly aerodynamic cars
Right.
by trying a million different things at essentially low to no cost.
Right, and so
Much more experimental in your design,
yeah,
right?
and so, I mean, basically, in some mathematical way, what you're doing often when you're looking at a design problem is and this will sound slightly too clinical, but I think it's true. You're exploring some multivariate space.
Mm-hmm.
You're varying a parameter between here and here and another one between here. So strength and weight. Right. You're making some trade-off. Well, one of the things you can do through using computing and using statistical techniques is I no longer have to go through this kind of propose and dispose. And I may have told you this before. Often when I see a traditional way of doing design, I equate it to the game Battleship, where, remember that game Battleship as a kid? You don't?
Never did the video game thing.
This is not a video game. This is the paper game. This is the board game where you put down the little battleships and then you guess and you say B2 and the other guy goes miss or hit. So there's some people in the audience who remember this game. Really, what a deprived
Monopoly?
childhood. It's just like Monopoly. So when people
I'm a business writer. I played Monopoly.
Exactly. So I think we're often trying to propose things and then we're saying no, no, no. As opposed to if you use a computer, you can explore the whole space and say, find me the optimal solution to the problem. Don't make me keep guessing and sending it out for a week or two. And I think that's a better technique.
So let's take some audience questions. There are people here with microphones. I see someone there and someone in the back. Oh, come on, people. There we are. Right here in the second row. And if you don't mind, just identify yourself when you
Sure, I'm Bert Hamner with Hydrovolts. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for letting us all be here. So how are you going to take this wonderful concept and make it available to the 100,000 small manufacturing companies out there that don't have $150,000 to buy this?
So,
Especially in a world where as we're going to, as you said, with 3D printing, Micro manufacturing and distributed manufacturing is going to be all over the place by people who don't have the budget for big corporate software programs.
Exactly.
How can you help them?
So perfect timing on the question. I was trying to celebrate the Giants' victory on Sunday night, and I was kind of in heaven. And I got this email from the CTO of the U.S. government, Anish Chopra, who's now leaving to go do other public service. But he's been very interested in this question, and the exact question came up, because I agree with you. We're going to see distributed manufacturing, micro-manufacturing like we've never seen, and a resurgence of American manufacturing. And one of the things we talked about is doing something very similar to the Clean Tech Partner Program for small manufacturers, but do it online. So make sure that, for example, particularly the place I'm really interested in is this idea around simulation, is that I think there are design tools available and relatively affordable, and we're bringing more design tools online. And so what I'd like to say to a manufacturer is you can design your parts and you can do the analysis and simulation and get this benefit of this massive computing power behind it and do it online. And so where Anish announced something yesterday in which we're going to do a similar kind of program to the Clean Tech Partner Program for simulation and analysis for small manufacturers.
In the back.
Okay. My name is Warren Wilson. I'm with Ovum Research. Actually, I have a question for each of you. Mark, you mentioned that there hasn't been as much traction in the process industries.
No, that was Carl.
That was me.
Oh, that was
I don't even know what process industries are.
In the research that I do on the use of...
Yeah, so the process one I agree with. I think there are very demonstrable returns, and that's why I'm saying it's not a trade-off around long-term. I've spent a lot of time with Amory Lovins, talking about things in the process industry. He's worked on specific projects and demonstrated it and calculated it to the nth degree. Why? I have no idea why those operating costs haven't made it into the, kind of the mainstream of this is how we do things now. That is one place where what we're trying to do is build it into our tools so that people can, look at the difference between fat pipes and skinny pipes and big pumps and little pumps and different routings, which are some of the, simple techniques to get more efficiencies, and that you can take alternative routing schemes and that you can actually calculate and you can integrate over time to understand the costs. Because I think if people are presented with the costs, it will actually happen. I think some of the stuff that you said, certainly some of the take-up in buildings is better when there's an owner-operator involved or someone who knows they're going to own it for the long term. This idea of flipping building, so we're sitting in a building, it's owned by a REIT. It didn't own it 5 years ago. It probably won't own it 5 years from now. I think that's where you have two possible vectors. One is something happens legislatively to demand that buildings are more energy efficient. The second thing is tenants. We can all demand more energy efficient buildings. Those are two areas where I think we have the greatest potential to do it. Asking some of these people whose goals are pure financial return to do it for good, I think it's pushing spaghetti up a hill.
It is interesting,
That's not mixing
though,
a metaphor.
In the third row here.
Hi there. My name is Catherine Mashansky. I'm the director of the Business Council on Climate Change here in San Francisco. I was really interested in a comment you meant on your interaction with your board on sustainability. I just returned from the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, and a lot of the sustainability discussion that I witnessed, I saw a lot of CEOs, when asked about sustainability-related endeavors, they said it was very difficult to make the case to their boards for some of the initiatives they wanted to pursue because of the short-term, long-term trade-off, right? They have quarterly reporting standards they have to meet, and it makes it difficult in that sort of situation to push some of the things that they really want to do sustainability-wise. And so in the case of Autodesk's very impressive sustainability initiatives, I was wondering, is this a case where some of the things that you're doing, you don't report to the board because it doesn't fit into some of the reporting requirements that they've set up? Or is it something they're not interested in and you're pursuing because you really believe there are business opportunities there?
Yeah, mine is probably, it's not because it's not important to individuals on the board. I don't actually think that's the role of a board of a public company. So I have slightly contrarian views about what the role of the board is in a public company. I think many people who are on boards, and particularly many who show up in Davos and talk about it, have a much more expansive view of what the role of a board is. I think, primarily boards are set up, and this is the legal construct of boards of public companies, is that they are set up to be, the stewards of the company on behalf of the shareholders. They're here to look out and make sure, in many ways, they're the guardrails, that a company doesn't come off the tracks, that it reports its results accurately, that it's pursuing a sound and healthy financial strategy. The biggest thing that a board does is truthfully make sure that they have a CEO in place who's doing the right thing, because it's ultimately their decision to hire and fire the CEO. So I think there are a number of things that are incredibly important to the running of the company that a board does. I think when you get to the more expansive view of what a board does, that says, you can, at Davos, I can talk to 9 out of 10 board members who will tell me that they drive the strategy of the company. It's actually a fairly silly construct if you think about it. Board members work, tens of days a year. In the case of Autodesk, at best. There are many board members who will say, I work 4 or 6 days a year. I'm often chosen because I'm in an industry that's not the actual industry in which the company participates. So when you use that as the backdrop, now, they're totally skilled in many other areas, but I think their real responsibility is looking out for shareholders. So I look at it and say, what the board members are interested in and need to be told about, what's the financial performance? Are there any rules or laws or regulations that we're breaking? Is the direction sound? Is the management team good? Is there a succession plan in place? Those are the things that I think rightfully fill up the agenda. When I look at it here, there's not only a management team, there's 7,000 employees and 10,000 people amongst our partners who are trying to decide what the right thing to do is about adding what goes into a product, how do we reach our customers with it, what goes on in our Clean Tech Partner Program. So it's less that I would have zero embarrassment talking about it to the board or any reason to hide it. I just think there are other things that really are the statutory role of the board in running a public company.
So let me put the question slightly differently. Your job is to, develop a management team. I assume you spend a fair amount of time with customers as well.
Yep.
You got to worry some about Wall Street and analysts. So you have a typical CEO's job with a lot of constituencies to manage. What do you think your role is with regard to sustainability? How deep do you go, or do you basically trust Linnell and others to?
I basically don't trust Linnell.
Well,
that's why she had such nice things to say about my active role in this. If I trust her, I could just let her do it. No. Sorry, Linnell. Mark made that happen.
I gave him a softball there.
Exactly.
Yeah, he couldn't resist.
I actually think I think 2 things about it and why I've had such an interest. Personally and professionally, I think it's one of the single biggest problems we face as, a civilization. I think it's incredibly important that we deal with it. I think it's incredibly important that both individually and professionally that businesses deal with this issue. The second one is, like I said, sustainability as something that you design and engineer and try to optimize is representative of what we try to do with all of our products. We're trying to give people better tools to make better decisions. And so if there's a gigantic problem out there, why not use it as the example to where you can have, like the gentleman back there talked about, if I can go to somebody who's not interested and say, with this tool, you can design your process plant to be this much more efficient, and it will turn into a return on investment of X. Why would you not do that? So it's just a great example of the power of these computational tools and the power of 3D modeling. So it makes total sense to combine the two in that way.